Right. Now.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Afternoon, Mr. Turner.
The next witness, my lord, is Mr. John Blackwood of the Scottish Association of Landlords.
Good afternoon, Mr. Blackwood. Good afternoon. Now, I'm sure Mr. Turner's got some questions for you, so I'll ask him to start.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you. Mr. Blackwood, before we begin, just a brief reminder, this afternoon's hearing will be transcribed. If you could try and speak as slowly and clearly as possible, that will help our stenographers.
Okay.
Thank you. Could you state your full name, please?
John Blackwood.
Thank you. And what is your current position, Mr. Blackwood?
I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Association of Landlords.
Thank you. And how long have you held that position?
I was one of the founding directors back in 2001 with the responsibility for developing and running the organisation and continue to this day in that post.
Thank you. The Scottish Association of Landlords, is it referred to by an acronym?
SAL, yes.
Thank you. SAL has provided a response to a Rule 8 request from the inquiry, is that correct?
Yes.
My lord, that is reference SCI SAL XXX number 1. I'm going to ask you some questions this afternoon, Mr. Blackwood, arising out of that Rule 8 response. We have a limited amount of time today, we just have an hour. We may not get to everything that's in the response or indeed any other documents that you provided, but just offer you some reassurance that everything that's in there and other documents will be taken into account fully by the inquiry and indeed by the chair. Excuse me. First of all, could I ask you, what is SAL?
The Scottish Association of Landlords is a representative group of landlords and the only representative group operating solely in Scotland for landlords and letting agents.
Thank you. And who are its members?
We have a wide range of members, from individual landlords owning 1 or 2 properties through to larger corporate entities and small businesses, as well as, of course, letting agents as well too, which operate throughout the country. So we've got a wide, diverse range of members.
Thank you. And can you tell us, Lordship, how many members you have at the moment?
We've in the region of 4,500 members. We also, just for the record as well, have some charities and other organisations who are business members of the association.
Thank you. You mentioned you have both landlords and letting agents. Can you tell us what the split is between them, roughly? Now
you're asking the questions. Yeah, we have in the region of 600 letting agent members, and the remainder will be landlord and business members.
Thank you. And could you tell us what kinds of properties we're talking about here?
It's a very diverse range within, it is representative of the wider private rented sector, so we are looking at your individual small flats and tenements, as well as larger houses as well too. So we span the entire range of accommodation that's available in the private rented sector in Scotland. And
is it just the private rental sector that your members operate in?
Some might operate beyond that. Some could well be social landlords as well too, but obviously our main jurisdiction is supporting people in the private rented sector, some of which might be rural landlords as well, operating in rural Scotland.
Which brings us to my next question. Where are your members operating?
So they're literally all over Scotland, but yes, as I say, largely in our urban areas, as you can imagine, where the private rented sector is largely centred in Scotland, but also in rural Scotland as well too, which could be your estates, farmland, etc.
You mentioned that the size of your members varies greatly in terms of numbers of properties. Can you give an indication of how many properties you think you represent in terms of the private rental sector stock in Scotland?
So, as a representative group, if we extrapolate our membership base across the entire private rented sector with regards to the number of properties they collectively manage, we're looking about in the region of 47% of the private rented sector in Scotland.
Thank you.
as you can imagine, some of our letting agent members are managing a considerable number of properties, and a few of our members might be large landlords.
And what kind of work does the Scottish Association of Landlords do?
We're largely a representative group that's there to lobby and campaign on behalf of the sector. A big part of our work is providing information and support as well too. So it's quite diverse as a traditional membership organisation would be in order to support the sector. Our job is about empowering the private rented sector to do the best job it possibly can and support our members in that way.
Thank you. You mentioned there providing information to your members. We're obviously here to discuss the pandemic. Did the Scottish Association of Landlords have any role in providing information to members during the pandemic?
Yes, and as you can probably imagine, that was a big part of our role at that time during the pandemic. We were constantly providing information to our members, consulting with Scottish Government and ministers to ensure that we were relaying the right information at the right time too. We also offer a free advice line to our members, so you can imagine we were inundated throughout the entire period by members posing individual questions based on a lot of the information that was provided by government at that time.
Thank you. You mentioned there an advice line. Is that the only way that you communicate with your members, or are there other means?
No. Traditionally with membership organisations we are no different. We have a range of email bulletins that go out periodically. We have a landlord-focused magazine as well too. During the pandemic we did switch to doing online meetings, which actually we continue to do to this day, rather than in-person meetings. So we were constantly communicating through various mediums with our members.
Thank you.
And of course our website as well too.
You mentioned that you were communicating the guidance that was provided by government during the pandemic. How did you find the guidance that was being issued by the government at the time?
I think we do appreciate that everybody was working under great pressure and the government was operating under emergency circumstances, so it was moving at a very fast pace. And for us, at times it was very difficult to get the right information timiously enough to be able to get that out. There were statements being made on a daily basis by the government, and of course we needed more detailed guidance to back that up and of course support our members to ensure they are abiding by the law, doing the right thing and supporting them the best way we possibly can. So it was very difficult sometimes to get the right guidance and the right information, or when we did get it, it was some time after statements were made and there were gaps in the guidance which we had to try and fill.
If I could pick up some of the matters that you've mentioned there, picking up timing, first of all, what were the concerns around that?
Well, as we were aware during the time, there were daily statements being made by the First Minister in particular, but overall by different ministers in the Scottish Government, and we were having to react to that because, of course, like many, we were all watching the news bulletins, and when new statements were being made, we were thinking, well, how are we going to adapt to that? How are we going to comply with that? So that was difficult, and it would take some time, sometimes weeks, before we actually got firm guidance on a particular statement or point that was made at the time.
So you were finding sometimes there was a period of time from the announcement when you were supposed to effectively begin complying and the guidance in order to actually comply. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
or it was more, this is what we're going to be doing and this is what we want to happen. But of course some of that would take legislation in order to bring it in. But as soon as a statement's made to the public, of course the public thinks, well, I need to comply with this, or what does that mean? What's the detail behind those statements? And of course these are the questions we were constantly asking government at the time.
What's the consequence of that for your members?
Confusion. Our members were very confused at that time, and as you can imagine, we were inundated with questions. What does this mean? Remember as well, we had a range of different guidance depending on where landlords were in the country. So there wasn't even a standard simple guidance that would cover all landlords within Scotland. And of course it did diverge to what was happening in the rest of the UK as well too. So I think overall our members were very confused. I think it's fair to say so were we, and it's our job to try and give as clear guidance as we possibly can to our members, and that was difficult for us to be able to do that.
Did you try and address those issues on behalf of your members in the sense of where there was a lack of clarity or a lack of understanding?
Yes, we did. I have to say at the time we had very close contact with the Scottish Government officials. That was practically on a daily basis, if not certainly early on a daily basis. And of course that was as matters were evolving and new guidance was being developed. And as I say, of course, they were working at pace to issue the guidance. We were trying to feed into that the best way we possibly could, but there were still gaps there which we felt were still unmet, and guidance that we were struggling to be able to make sense of and give the best information to our members to understand.
You mentioned an example of that in the Rule 8 response in relation to gas safety checks that were being carried out or not being carried out around that time. Could you perhaps explain to His Lordship what the difficulty was around that?
Yes, so one of the issues with this is, of course, the difference between devolved matters and reserved matters between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. And gas safety checks. Safety checks as a whole were discussed in the sense of, are they required? Should landlords be doing them? Are they essential to be carried out? When it comes to electrical safety, that is something that is reserved to the Scottish Government, and that they could dictate what was happening there. When it came to gas safety checks, that wasn't. That was a reserved matter, and the UK Government took a very different view to the Scottish Government in that regard as to whether landlords should be carrying out gas safety checks or not. So it took some time to clear that up, and effectively the Scottish Government had to concede that, of course, gas safety checks are required to be done. It is a requirement of UK law and the Health and Safety Executive in doing so. So again, there was a change to the guidance to reflect that, and that again caused confusion, and that's what we've stated in our submission.
And you'd mentioned, of course, that because of these UK regulations, your members are having to look at potentially two different sources of information, and there appear to be a conflict between them. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, indeed. And, going back to at the time, of course, we were all watching the news, both here in Scotland and the wider UK news as well too. And we were hearing the differences as to what was happening in England and Wales compared to Scotland. That in itself was often confusing people. But certainly landlords were thinking, what do I comply with? What do I need to do? And that's where guidance was really important. And sadly, we felt sometimes that guidance was lacking.
You mentioned geographic differences for landlords. What were the issues arising there?
Well, remember we had the different zones which operated within Scotland. So many landlords, even with small portfolios, have properties in different local authority areas. And indeed they probably themselves can live in a different local authority area, and that might not be many miles from where they actually live, but technically they are, of course, in different local authority areas. So it was confusing for them to understand what rules apply to that property compared to another property in a different local authority area. And could them, if they were self-managing, could they get to that property to do X, Y and Z work, because they themselves were restricted as to their travel, and they could have been operating within different rules within their home local authority. So that was all very confusing.
Thank you. You've talked there about the levels, and some of the rules obviously relating to that were not landlord or indeed property specific, they're more general in terms of travel restrictions and the like. Did you find yourself giving advice in respect of more general pandemic matters in terms of that, things that were coming out and restrictions that were coming out to the populace at large?
Our support and guidance would be restricted restricted to, of course, what was relevant to provide advice and information about with regards to the private rented sector. So anything to do with letting property is obviously the sole remit for us, and that we wouldn't venture beyond that. But for instance, there was a term often used in the guidance, and I did refer to it in the submission, and it was with regards to, is the works that you're going to be carrying out reasonably necessary? So that was a term which we struggled with to understand, and we did often ask the government for clarity on that how do you define reasonably necessary? And that wasn't forthcoming.
I'll come back to that if I may, Mr. Blackwood. Just in terms of the guidance that was being provided, did you feel there was any obvious omissions?
The clarity with regards to that point and the definition of reasonably necessary, I think that was the main thing. With regards to entering properties, that was another major issue because, of course, landlords still had the duty to carry out essential maintenance, repairs, and, of course, safety checks that I've already touched upon. But what's the guidance there? Under what circumstances can you enter a property? What precautions do you need to take? That wasn't there within the guidance. In fact, we had to look elsewhere with regards to the health sector. And, for those who were carrying out caring duties, what precautions did they take in entering someone's home and try to apply that to our sector. So that was an obvious gap there that we were trying to interpret and fill in our own way.
As an association representing landlords, you'll no doubt be familiar with the various regulations and guidance that applies to landlords in ordinary times. Did you have any comment about the form in which guidance was being issued during the pandemic in terms of statutory, non-statutory guidance, and indeed any preference that you might have liked in that regard? Our
preference would be statutory guidance. We're used to working within statutory guidance guidelines. But I think things were again moving at a pace, and it was very difficult to get clear guidance. I think that's the best way I can put it. So that just wasn't happening. And of course, we were constantly asking for, well, what do we do about this? So another situation arose, which, to be fair, none of us really thought about, and thought, well, how do we deal with this situation, or how can we advise landlords about this? So that, of course, took a number of people within the civil service time to be able to collaborate on and come back to us with clearer information. And the issue there was, even though we maybe did get clearer guidance in some circumstances, it was the time it took to get that. And in the meantime, landlords and letting agents were still looking for answers.
You mentioned the uncertainty about what landlords could and couldn't do during the pandemic. One thing that you've mentioned to us is facilitation of house moves. Could you explain to His Lordship what the difficulty was there, or what the issue was there, I should say?
Yeah, the issue was, of course, determining key workers, because they were still able to move. So we had landlords and agents saying, especially in the very early days of the pandemic, house moves were set up. So they were going to be happening, and that could have been a few weeks hence from the beginning of the pandemic. And of course, they were asking the question, can we still go ahead? But are these key workers that you're moving, is it essential that they move? So is it reasonably necessary to carry out that move? So these were all the questions that were being raised at the time. So we did have healthcare workers that were moving within the private rented sector from one property to another, and indeed from other sectors into a rented accommodation for obvious reasons, that they were maybe wanting to isolate themselves from their families or relocate in order to do their essential work. So we were very much involved in providing the support and assistance to landlords and agents to facilitate that to happen. So there was a question over what is a key worker and how do you define that as well too.
And in terms of travel, you've talked about there whether it's reasonably necessary. Again, in any new tenancy, or in a lot of new tenancies, there's a number of parties involved in that. The tenant, most obviously, the landlord, potentially an agent involved. In your experience, did you find the views being expressed as to whether something was reasonably necessary at that time were the same amongst those groups of people?
Oh, there's completely divergent in some cases, as you can imagine, and the motivations and priorities of different individuals obviously come into play as well too. So the message very much was stay at home, don't leave your home unless completely necessary, and even that could have been restricted, especially in the early days. But people were saying it's essential that I move into this home. We had to facilitate that. So, for instance, letting agents, their offices were closed. So how can you facilitate that? So who are the players in making that happen at that time? And of course, it was convincing them too that it was appropriate to carry out that work. And ultimately, they were coming to us for advice, saying, can we do this? And under what circumstances can we say no? So yes, it was confusing, but there were different priorities of different players in that at that time.
From what you've described there, there's a tension between people who want to move and people who are reticent for whatever reason. Was there any particular group amongst them that was more keen on moving or pushing forward moves than others, or was it very situational?
It was situational, but I think it's fair to say that I think the key player for the move to take place was the tenant, or the prospective tenant at the time, because their motivation was to find that new home. And to be fair, many of them were struggling. They needed a home to move into, especially if it had been pre-arranged and set up. They'd maybe sold their own home or whatever the circumstances might well be. They were homeless. They had to move. So that was, of course, a priority for them for that to happen at that time.
Because of the relationship in a landlord-tenant relationship, the landlord is receiving rent generally from that relationship, one might have supposed that landlords would be keen to get tenants in to empty properties. Was that the case? I mean, it's implicit, I suppose, from what you said, that the tension, if the tenant's pro, then the landlord is more reticent. Was there any reason for that reticence, particularly that you came across?
I think they were everybody was frightened. Let's face it, we're in a pandemic, so the message was very much stay at home, protect yourself and protect others. So certainly our members were very cognizant of that, and it was important for them, to follow the guidance and later follow the law as well too. So I think that was a priority for them. And you were always worried that you were going to do something which actually could cause harm to someone else. So sometimes the best thing to do is do nothing, and I think many landlords were thinking that was what they should be doing at that time.
Were there any additional steps that required to be taken around that time in respect of properties to prepare them?
Yeah, in the sense of hygiene, in the sense of how do you carry out these physical moves, how can you do that? Again, that was confusing at the time. There was very little information early on about how can you make sure that the property was sanitised enough for somebody new to move into it, especially if it had been lying empty for a period of time. So I remember, just anecdotally, initially, there was the thought that if you just leave it a few days, then maybe the virus would no longer be in existence, so therefore you could safely move in. And that changed, because we didn't really know the life cycle of the virus at that particular time. And did it need to be completely sanitised, or how would you do that? So there was a lot of guidance round before somebody came in, wipe the place down, and how do you do that, etc., etc. So that was always very difficult to understand and interpret.
You've spoken to us about what was essential work at the time and the confusion in respect to that guidance. Did that become any clearer as the pandemic progressed in terms of what you could and couldn't do?
No, I don't think it did. Obviously now it's not that long ago, but it does seem a while in some of our minds to think back now and understand what was happening at that time. But no, I think the guidance was never clear on that, and and again, some people were very reticent. It's not just for house moves. I think one of the biggest issues was gaining access to properties to do safety checks, for instance. That was not a priority to tenants. So they were very clear, we don't want anybody coming into our home. That's what we've been told by the government, and quite rightly, that we had to respect that. But of course we had safety checks that needed to be carried out. So a lot of them didn't happen at that time because of that, and that's hence why I was mentioning the confusion in the guidance. At least if you've got it clear in guidance, and in particular statutory guidance, you could say, well, here it is, you can read it for yourself. But a lot of tenants were very clear, they just didn't want anybody coming into their home, and I think that's understandable. So that was safety checks, but repairs was another big issue as well too. You know, what is a priority for the tenant? And that varies from tenant to tenant.
Did that cause any concerns for your members in terms of, I suppose, potentially being in breach of safety regulations and the like?
Yeah, and you can imagine that if you're a member of an organisation like ourselves, we're encouraging them to do the best job that they possibly can, to be empowered to do that. We give them the information, we tell them what the law is, we advise and train them accordingly, and we would expect them to follow suit and take heed to that information. So yes, they were wanting to make sure that they did the right thing, and I think that's only fair that we should be expecting them to do that. It's the legal responsibility as well.
We've spoken about the information and guidance available to landlords. I wonder if I might ask you about information to tenants. I suppose it's implicit in everything in the landlord-tenant relationship that there's two sides to every coin, as it were. Did you have any thoughts about the information or the quality of information that was being provided to tenants at the time?
I think equally, I think that was confusing. We were hearing that from our tenants. Our members were reporting that back to us. And yes, they were saying we don't know what we can allow or what's right in our... And remember, it's their home, and they have a right to protect their home and feel safe and secure within their home. So they felt that actually we don't know what we should be doing, or what is safe to do and what isn't, or what I can be able to do safely, effectively, and allow within my own home. So that was very confusing for tenants. So, and can I say in particular with tenants who had health issues themselves, so there was a lot of confusion there. They maybe felt vulnerable, they were vulnerable, and so they were being extra cautious, and of course they were encouraged to do so as well.
Thank you. You'd mentioned when we spoke about guidance for landlords, the fact that announcements were made by ministers and others, and then guidance came out subsequently. Was that pattern repeated in respect of tenants' information?
I'm sorry, I really wouldn't be able to comment too much on the information that was provided to tenants, obviously, and largely supporting landlords. At that time, we were referring landlords to the guidance that was available overall to the PRS, so, you know, equally it could have been appropriate for tenants to read that and understand that too. But obviously our job was not specifically about supporting tenants in that particular area.
At paragraph 8 of your relate response on page 2, if I may, there's a couple of statements you refer there from the First Minister. No one can be evicted from their home during this crisis, on March 29th, 2020, and nobody should be facing eviction as a result of this crisis, 26th of March 2020. Were there any consequences arising from those statements?
Yes, well, as you can see in the 26th of March 2020, the first statement that was made by the First Minister was nobody should be facing evictions, so it's a statement of intent there as a result of the crisis. And of course everybody was watching that on a daily basis, and of course we were immediately getting the calls saying, well, what does that mean? And of course we were looking, well, what's the guidance, what's the legislation that's going to be framed on the basis of that statement? And that was something that wasn't forthcoming. Then 3 days later, on the 29th of March, there was a further statement: no one can be evicted from their home during this crisis. That's a clear statement, I think, there from the First Minister. That was not the case. Evictions did still take place and could still take place. But you can imagine, for many people hearing that, they might think, oh, well, I'm not going to get evicted, so do I need to pay my rent? And many people were struggling to pay their rent because of obviously not having the income from work. They were maybe laid off or whatever the case might have been at that time. So is there a priority then to pay your rent? For many people there wasn't. So we do know from the information we've received from members that as a result of that, some tenants didn't pay. I have to say, we did encourage landlords to work with their tenants, and in most cases that was successful, and the government did commend landlords later on for working with their tenants and sustaining those tenancies. But that created not only confusion, but people thinking, actually, I don't need to be worried about eviction.
Can I ask, the first statement on the page, second statement in terms of time, is, as you've pointed out, erroneous. Did you bring that up with officials?
We did at the time, and we said, actually, what does that mean, first of all? Well, so when is this going to happen? Because actually, of course, we would need regulations, at least for that to come into being, but when is this going to happen? Because we know evictions are still being carried out.
Did you get a response?
So, well, that was, I think it was very confusing at that time, to be honest. We weren't getting a clear response on it. In fact, to just follow up on that, it was the 11th of December 2020 before regulations were actually published, which didn't put a ban on evictions. There was never a ban on evictions, as I'm sure you're aware. But there was action taken whereby sheriff officers couldn't enforce an order for evictions, but orders for evictions were still being granted at that time and continue to be so. So the statement in itself wasn't correct.
Thank you, Lord. You've preempted my next question, my Lord, which was...
I do apologise.
I was about to ask about feedback to government, Mr. Blackwood. You've answered my question in part. Did you have the opportunity to feedback to government?
Yes, we did. As I say, we had a very good contact with the government. I can't fault that. On a daily basis, we were bombarding them with questions, if nothing else. But we've always had a good relationship with the civil service, and we were in close contact.
Were those existing contacts that you had before the pandemic?
Yes, they were.
Did you have any additional involvement during the pandemic with the government?
I think certainly, in a state of emergency, they had other people allocated to different tasks. So yes, we did come across, and we did get support from some people who we hadn't had contact with before. But I think our main contacts, it was not one single point of contact, but our main contacts were people who were very familiar. We were familiar with them, and they were familiar with us.
His Lordship heard this morning from a witness who sat on the private rented sector resilience group, and they informed His Lordship that the Scottish Association of Landlords also sat on that for a while. Could you tell His Lordship about that group?
Yes, I was co-chair of the private rented sector resilience group, and obviously the whole purpose of the group was to be a conduit to government, to be able to have that opportunity. We sat every 2 weeks, I think it was, with the civil service to be able to discuss what were the latest issues and what we were we coming across and experiencing. So there was certainly very much a need for that group. In time, what happened was obviously it became very focused on support for tenants, which I don't deny needed to happen. But I was also keen that we had support for landlords and other aspects of the private rented sector. So I actually felt that the group should almost have split at some point, and we should have had a tenants resilience group and a landlords one. But that didn't happen. So, but that group was quite diverse, quite a wide range of interests on that. There was only 2 of us representing the private rented sector on that group.
Do you feel there should have been more representation of landlords on that group?
To be fair, there are few organisations like ourselves operating in Scotland, so and there were existing contacts that the Scottish Government had, so I don't have criticism of that. It was more the focus of the group, and that it was very much focused on support for tenants and what we could be doing to alleviate any hardship that tenants could be incurring. And I wholeheartedly supported that, and I would still do that if that happened again. But I think we were only seeing one side of the coin, one argument there. So I was able to use that group to be able to say this is what landlords are experiencing, this is the guidance we need. And of course that was equally of interest to tenants and tenants groups representatives as well too, many of whom are advice agencies equally speaking to landlords as well. But I think there should have been another group more focused on those providing the accommodation and going into the detail of the support that they need.
You've mentioned that you had existing contacts in government and that you were already using those. Did that mean that the PRS Resilience Group was not your only conduit in terms of feeding that information back?
Oh, indeed. Yes, that's right, yes.
Our witness this morning suggested that if we come back into a pandemic at any point, and I'm sure you're aware that his lordship is seeking to learn lessons, she thought that a group like the PRS Resilience Group would be a group that should be available to government, but she suggested that perhaps a wider array of voices, I think she suggested as many voices as possible in terms of providing a breadth of view. Do you have any comment on that? Do you think that would be a useful lesson for his lordship to consider?
I think the group was quite wide-ranging in the sense of the interests that were represented as part of that group. We had a lot of stakeholders involved in that group. I certainly think, yes, that group would need to come back into being in the event of another pandemic, but perhaps there was maybe more of a role for subgroups within that group to focus on the different interests within the group, because it was very clear that there were different interests around the stakeholders who were part of that group.
Thank you. I'd like to talk very briefly, if I may, Mr. Blackwood, about tenant support, because of course that nothing exists in a vacuum, and I think it's quite important to understand that. You mentioned that tenant support was put in place. Could you tell his lordship what support was available to tenants?
So the first thing that was available to tenants was a hardship loan. So it was an interest-free loan that was available to tenants, and that was open for applications. I do have a note of the dates from the 7th of December 2020 to the 31st of December 2021, and that was managed by the Energy Saving Trust at the time. And then later on, and this was an announcement that was made on the 23rd of June 2021, and that was further launched on the 27th of September 2021, and that was a hardship grant. Now that was something that the Resilience Group very much focused on, and we were very keen to see more financial assistance being provided to tenants. That's of course of interest to landlords too. Anything that would support a tenant to help them pay their rent is in all of our interests, so we very much supported that, but that did take some time to come in. So prior to that, all we had was interest-free loans that were available to tenants, and that was called the hardship loan at the time. My understanding is it wasn't taken up very well. Likewise, there was an interest-free loan available for landlords, but I can imagine that wasn't taken up very much either. Simply because in a time of crisis and potential debt that people might be incurring, the last thing many people want to do is take on another loan. And whether you're a landlord or a tenant, I think your attitude towards that would be no different. So I don't think either of these schemes were very successful.
Thank you. You mentioned there that landlords have an interest in seeing that tenants have the ability to pay their rent effectively. Did you find, or did your members find, that was assisting members to pay their rent?
No, initially it wasn't. So I think there was the issue about uptake and tenants being aware of it, but feeling that it would be appropriate for them to take on a loan for the points that I've already mentioned. But equally beyond that, tenants were very concerned about how sustainable is that for the future. That's what we were hearing from our members. So the uptake was low, and actually for those who did get it, anecdotally we were hearing from our members, they were maybe aware that they had signposted their tenant to it, they'd maybe got it, but they weren't passing that on to the landlord. They weren't actually using it for the purpose in which it was intended, i.e. to pay the rent. That didn't happen. So when we came round to discussing the grant fund, we said it's essential that it is about paying the rent, and that should be paid direct to the landlord, and therefore negating the rent arrears, which did happen, but that wasn't launched until the 27th of September 2021.
You mentioned there paying it directly to the landlords. Do you mean that you'd proposed that payment be made directly to the landlords in respect of rent?
Well, to pay off the arrears effectively. So the grant would be paid, it would be a grant to the tenant, but the condition was it would be paid direct to the landlord. That's how it...
Is that how it in fact operated?
Yes, yeah.
Would you accept that to that extent, because the arrears were being paid off, because the rent was being paid off, that did provide some support to landlords?
It did. And again, that's why we advocated for it, and the landlords were saying, why shouldn't our tenants get this support and get this help? And therefore, if they're able to get that help, they can pay their rent, and that there's no issues here with rent arrears and no need to even think about eviction procedures. So on the whole, we thought that would be a good thing. But that was for any arrears that arose between 23rd of March 2020 and the 9th of August 2021. So that was the period in which this grant would cover any arrears between that time. But one of the issues with it was, well, how does a tenant access that? How do they get to know about that? And again, there was no clear guidance on who do you apply to, because it was operated by our local authorities, who could use their discretion as to who gets it and who doesn't get it. So there was no central coordination of that. The Scottish Government didn't provide a list of these are the contacts, so we could, as landlords and agents, give that to our tenants, say this is where you go for the help. In fact, Sal ourselves, we had to go and try and gather those contact details to be able to disseminate, so that wasn't provided by government. So it was run by local authorities, and I have to say I think every local authority did treat it differently and allocate the money differently as well too, which again just added to confusion as well.
Thank you. We've spoken there about financial support. You've mentioned two other things in the course of your evidence today relating to, I suppose, substantive questions about eviction processes. You mentioned that eventually there was a moratorium on evictions, is that correct, for a period?
Yes, in the sense of a delay on when, the notice periods were extended, so it became a 6-month notice period, so it just took longer to be able to go through the process effectively, but there was never a ban on evictions, as we've already mentioned.
Thank you. That was going to be my second question, was about the notice period, so you just covered that. Thank you, Mr.
With
Blackwood.
Exception to, of course, sheriff officers, as I've already alluded to, on the 11th of December 2020, there was sheriff officers weren't allowed to enforce eviction orders.
Thank you.
And in some cases, well, certainly in Glasgow was the last area that moved to level 2, and that wasn't until the 5th of June 2021.
If I could ask you now, or if I could turn to some questions about the financial effects for landlords. You've mentioned the fact that rent arrears were being incurred during the pandemic period. Are you able to tell His Lordship anything about the degree to which those rent arrears were accruing?
Yes, again anecdotally, but what we were hearing from our members, that if someone is in rent arrears as a result of the pandemic, that really extended their arrears to a period equivalent to 6 months effectively. So they would have been in arrears more as a direct result. We could see a correlation there between the extension of the notice periods of 6 months to the increase in rent arrears that was due by the tenant, which equated equally in many cases to 6 months. So effectively our argument was it just prolonged the process, which, yes, okay, prevented eviction at an earlier period, but it increased indebtedness to the tenants. So whereas if a grant system came in to play much earlier, perhaps a lot of this debt that accumulated by tenants might not have actually happened.
You've mentioned there the rent arrears that was extended by 6 months. What was the rent arrears that you were experiencing before the pandemic?
I think, anecdotally we were looking at perhaps 9 months there, and that was extended to about 15 months. But it's very anecdotal, but this was the information we were receiving from our members and analysing as well too.
Were landlords receiving any other kind of direct financial support from government?
So all that was available to landlords was the interest-free loan. So that's all the government was prepared to offer. And as I say initially, that's all that was offered to the tenants as well. And then grant funding came in for tenants, which, as I say, was welcome. But there was no equivalent support to landlords. Our big issue about that was other businesses were supported in that time. Landlords were not, and certainly still to this day, are not seen as businesses. And unless they had offices or they were incorporated in some way, which they were able to, through other means, get some support. But there was no direct support available to housing providers in the private rented sector in the sense of private landlords. So, and even with the loan, it was very limited. So it was only for landlords who own 5 or fewer properties, but that would only be available to cover the loss of income of one property within that portfolio. And through our campaigning, that was later extended to up to 3 properties. So it was incredibly limited as to what the loan would actually cover. And of course, the big issue, as with tenants, is landlords, if they felt they were going to be in financial difficulty as a result of the pandemic, didn't want to then take the burden of a loan, albeit interest-free.
Again, Mr. Blackwood, looking towards lessons, is there any lesson that you think His Lordship might want to consider in that regard?
I think grant funding needs to be considered much earlier in a pandemic for both tenants and for landlords. I think we also need to think about, with regards to landlords, how do we classify them in such circumstances? Are they businesses? Are they essential workers, in the sense of the activities they carry out to ensure that someone's home is safe to continue to live in? But financially, the issue is they weren't self-employed, so therefore they didn't get the help that self-employed people were able to gain. They're not employed, so therefore furlough was not available to them. So for those landlords who are not incorporated, who rely solely on the income from their rental properties, there was no assistance available. So there were certainly gaps there in the support that was provided, and many landlords fell down those cracks in the regulation that was offered of assistance at the time, and that was a major problem. And even for our letting agent members, okay, some of whom could be incorporated, they had offices. If they weren't covered by the small business bonus scheme, which did give the £10,000 grant to small businesses and small premises there, if there were slightly larger offices that they were operating from, although there was the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Fund, letting agents were not classed within that. so they weren't seen as operating within the retail sector, albeit that they're selling services to people. Now, we lobbied for that to be changed, and at a later stage, letting agents were included within that guidance. So some of them eventually did get some assistance. But again, that was up for local authorities to decide which category do you fall into. So I think my message would be certainly grant funding should be made available much quicker, and should be more open, should be more transparent and easier to access. As I say, it was even difficult, especially for tenants, to understand where do you go for help? How do you apply for this money? And that was very difficult to find, hence why we had to go really to every local authority and ask, give us the contact details. So a central system of at least collating details of local authorities that could easily be disseminated, whether it was through a website or whatever. The government was very keen to try and give guidance on a daily basis, but when it came to accessing financial assistance, both landlords and tenants really didn't know where to go.
You've mentioned obviously the grant funding that we were talking about in terms of paying off arrears. One might, or his lordship might consider, when looking at lessons, that a scheme might be devised whereby monies goes to tenants and then flows through to landlords in that way. Would that have met all of your members' concerns at that time?
No, it probably wouldn't, for the simple reason that not everybody might use that to pay the rent. And I think we have to understand that we're in difficult times, and with fairness to tenants, that if you're struggling to think about how you're going to pay your bills at the end of the month, how you're going to put food on the table, often is the case that the last person you're going to think about paying is your landlord. Now, that's a reality of life, and so whereas actually securing the roof over your head perhaps should be the most important thing, it isn't for everybody. And everybody has their own priorities, and looking after your family and your family's interests is, for many, of course, the number one priority. So our issue very early on, and with the grant scheme, we were saying it has to be used for the purpose for which it is intended, and that's paying the rent. That's the sole purpose of that. There might be other assistance for the other living costs, but this was to do with rent. And the only way we could ensure that was by paying it to that landlord. Because the issue here, the policy objective was to prevent homelessness, was to secure that tenancy, prevent eviction. So I think we need to be cognizant of how can we make sure that money, in the form of a grant, public money, is used for the purpose in which it was intended. So I think that's essential in any kind of future grant scheme.
We talked about the difficulties or the restrictions on people moving into houses during the pandemic. Did your members experience any events in terms of people leaving?
Yeah, I would say it would be the same issues. Yeah, exactly.
Were there any particular patterns in terms of empty properties or the like that were different during the pandemic to normal times? Yeah,
certainly more properties were left empty. And that was a net result of the pandemic at that time. So, and at that time we were looking at how best can we utilise some of these properties. Could they be used for key workers, healthcare workers in particular? Could that be a route to using some of these properties? And again, in leaving a tenancy, lots of tenants were actually putting off moving, so they were staying in the property as well too, which often suited all parties. So, but yes, there were certainly properties lying empty because the whole sector was not working as it should, of course, in the state of emergency that we were in.
We've talked about the fact that a tenant scheme in an ideal world would meet the needs of a landlord with a sitting tenant if the money came through the tenant. It's probably implicit, but that scheme, would you agree, wouldn't work in circumstances where the property is empty?
Yes, yeah, of course. It means there is no income from that property. So, but again, that's perhaps where a grant scheme or maybe even an interest-free loan scheme, so could come in there to support those landlords with empty properties. Our priority was dealing with tenanted tenancies and how we can ensure that those tenancies could be sustained during the pandemic. And a lot of that was about the landlord working with the tenant. So I think I'd be giving the wrong impression to say that no tenant paid the rent during the pandemic. That, of course, didn't happen. And I'm very proud to say, through our support of certainly our members, but I think the wider private rented sector, is that landlords were cognisant of the problems that their tenants were facing. They knew the jobs that they were doing. So if they worked in the hospitality sector, they knew they weren't getting any income. So could they reduce the rent for a period during the pandemic? Some did do that. They worked with the tenants to sustain those tenancies. And that actually was a very successful strategy for many. And we do know that some, anecdotally, who worked in the hospitality sector were then able to go to the local supermarket and perhaps get a job there as well too. That happens. So they were able to gain alternative employment, and the landlord worked with them through that period. And we would encourage that in any future pandemic.
Thank you. Mr. Blackwood, we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to offer you an opportunity, if there's any particular key issues which you feel you particularly want to highlight to His Lordship, that either which we've touched upon before or which we potentially haven't touched upon, or you think there's any particular lessons which His Lordship might wish to consider. I'll give you that opportunity. Before I do that, I'll just remind you, we do have your relate response, thank you very much, and the other documents you provided. His Lordship will have an opportunity, or indeed had an opportunity, to consider that. But if there is anything that you wish to particularly highlight to him now, now's your opportunity.
Okay. Thank you. Well, my Lord, I guess really I think we've probably emphasised everything we can about the financial assistance that hopefully could be available in the future, and understanding that and accessing it as well too, so that it's very clear. Our biggest issue was lack of clear guidance, so that was really important. It needs to be provided timeously. Statements were being made, but it was some time before it was backed up with any guidance, let alone any legislation. So that period of limbo between a statement publicly being made by ministers and something actually happening in legislation created confusion, if nothing else, within the sector. There's a lack of recognition about the essential activities that landlords carry out, and letting agents, of course, too, with regards to ensuring that properties are safe and well maintained. And I'm talking about essential repairs, maintenance and safety. I think we would need to be very clear about that and really see landlords in their day-to-day activity as being essential key services that we should be supporting and making sure are still able to continue to a degree with their day-to-day work. I think with regards to restrictions, there was the extension to the notice periods on evictions. We do believe that resulted, okay, certainly landlords couldn't issue notice perhaps as soon as some might have, bearing in mind that most landlords did work with their tenants to sustain their tenancy. But actually for those who did have to evict after the pandemic, all that legislation did to extend the notice period was increase indebtedness to tenants. I don't think that was in anybody's interest, the tenants or indeed, of course, the landlords. So these are the main issues. And as I say, the financial assistance really not regarding landlords as businesses or supporting them as other small businesses were supported at the time. Thank you.
Well, Lord, that's all the questions I have, unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you, Mr. Turner. All that remains for me to do is to thank you, Mr. Blackwood, for your time and your efforts, for your very helpful evidence.
Thank you.
Right, 2:30.
All right. Good afternoon, my Lord.
Good afternoon, Ms. Van de Vee, this season. Right, who do you have for us today?
My Lord, this afternoon we have a panel of representatives of 3 housing associations that are all members of the Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations. We have Ms. Malpass from the Castleton Housing Association, Mr. Mallon from Govan Housing Association, and joining us who's joining us remotely, and we have Mr. Earl, who's from Dalmuir Housing Association.
Very good.
Dalmuir Park.
Very good, thank you. Now, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ms. Malpass, Mr. Mallon and Mr. Earl. There will be questions from you when you're ready, please.
Thank you, my Lord. Before I start, could I please remind you all that proceedings are being recorded and transcribed, and ask you just to speak slowly and clearly, and I'll try to do the same. If I could perhaps start by asking you each in turn to confirm your full name and your role now and during the pandemic, and also the housing association that you represent now and during the pandemic. And if we could perhaps start with Mr. Earl, Ms. Malpass, and then Mr. Mallon.
Yep, Gary Earl of Dalmuir Park Housing Association. I'm a finance officer with a remit to manage the wider role within the association. That was my job during the pandemic and remains at this time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Malpass.
Hello, I'm Claire Malpass. I'm the Chief Executive of Castleton Housing Association. I've worked at Castleton since 2007 and I was Chief Executive at the time of the pandemic.
Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Mallon.
Hi there, I am currently the Director of Community Enterprises at Govan Housing Association, but at the time of the pandemic I worked as a Business Transformation Manager at Ferguson Park Housing Association.
Thank you very much. You all previously attended a roundtable meeting with other housing associations and members of the inquiry team, and that report has been approved. And my Lord, for reference, that can be found under SCI GWSF XX 000004. So the intention today is for His Lordship to hear about some of the key issues and impacts experienced by your housing associations, by your tenants and by the wider communities as a consequence of restrictions in place during the pandemic. And that'll be under a number of broad themes. But before I list those themes, could I ask you please in turn each to provide a brief overview of the housing association you represent, giving an indication of its size and the types of properties it operates and their locations, the demographic of your tenants and the communities in which your properties are located, and also an indication of what your housing association normally does, in other words, in non-pandemic times. And if we could perhaps start with Mr. Earl, followed by Ms. Malpass, and then finally by Mr. Mallon again.
Thank you. Yeah, the association was registered in 1978, operating mainly in the Dalmuir area of Western Bartonshire, where we currently manage around 850 homes, which includes shared ownership and fully owned properties. The residents, approximately over 2,000, and they're contained within 1 to 5 bedroom apartments. Approximately 95% would be white, mixed ages relevant to apartment size, and obviously an area of deprivation and low income areas. The statistics would also apply to the wider area, albeit that some of the homes are with gardens would probably attract younger tenants and also younger families. Our association is heavily and densely populated as a tenemental stock. The association itself is community based, sets its own budget and is responsible for its investment programme. One of the things at Dalmuir Park is very unique, is it has its own care sector, has 2 sheltered housing complexes and also an out of school care group. And one of the additional things is that it would have its extensive wider role programme, which dovetails very well into the annual budget.
Thank you very much. Ms Malpass.
Yes, as I said, I work for Castleton Housing Association. We are a community-based social landlord based in the south of Glasgow. Castleton was formed in the 1950s as part of the refurbishment of the Gorbals, while the Gorbals tenements getting knocked down and new estates being built. So all of our stock is post 1950s. Mixture of flats and back and front door houses. Currently we have 177 properties. They are a mixture of family homes, one-bedroom homes, very similar to my colleague here. In terms of our tenure stock, we've got the household types. It's a mix of young families through to older residents. We do have some supported accommodation where individuals are supported by mental health charities or for addictions or have learning difficulties, and we also own a 40-bed residential unit for men with alcohol-related brain disease. In terms of our normal operations, we are a social landlord, so we own properties, rent them out, maintain them. However, Castleton also has two subsidiary companies. One is a pre-5 nursery. The other is a development trust where we deliver a whole range of community development activities. So pre-pandemic, we were doing the bricks and mortar of our operations, but we were also delivering a range of community development programmes, including managing a local park, and during COVID obviously this increased, but I know we'll go on to that later.
Thank you very much. And Mr Mallon, and of course you had a different role during the pandemic, so feel free to explain both the housing associations that you were involved in, both the current and the previous one, the Ferguson Park.
Yeah, sure. So just now I work for Govan Housing Association, and we have a stock of around 1,638 properties. And like the other housing associations, that's a mixture of tenemental properties and more modern properties. In terms of our structure, we have two subsidiary companies. We have one company which is the Govan Home Team, and they focus on delivering our maintenance and repair service for our stock. And we also have the Waterloo Company, which is our newer subsidiary, that focuses on the delivery of mid-market rent properties, factoring services, commercial and residential leaseholders, as well as it delivers our money advice service for Govan Housing Association tenants. In terms of Ferguson Park, it's a smaller housing association. It has around 802 homes, and those are mostly 2, 3 and 4 bedroom properties. Back and front door, a lot lower density than the kind of tenemental properties my colleagues mentioned. It also has a subsidiary company, so it is the Tannehill Centre, which is a charity. It's mainly a physical building with a number of different tenants, which include third sector and public sector bodies and organisations. But it also has a community development programme working with local groups and volunteers to deliver services that meet the needs of the local community. In terms of demographics and the social kind of makeup of Ferguson Park has a reputation of being one of the poorer areas of Scotland. But hopefully I'll show you through the evidence today that that's just one part of the community.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, we'll structure the discussion under a number of broad headings. So we'll be discussing issues and impacts under the headings community anchored organisations. Secondly, issues and impacts experienced by tenants and the wider community, delivery of welfare assistance by housing associations and role creep. Thirdly, housing related issues and impacts. Fourthly, issues related to key worker status and the definition of essential or key workers. Fifthly, financial support. Sixthly, issues and impacts experienced by housing associations. And finally, potential lessons to be learned. We'll come on to discuss role creep and operational issues experienced by your housing associations in more detail. But if we could start for now discussing community anchor organisations, and if I could please ask you to explain what community anchor organisations are, We've heard some of this already in the inquiry, but it'll be useful to have it from your perspective. Whether your housing association was a community anchor organisation during the pandemic, and in general terms, why community anchor organisations, including, if applicable, your own housing associations, were important during the pandemic, and any other relevant key issues. And I think on this one, if we could perhaps start with Mr. Mallon, because I think you have a particular interest in this due to endeavours during the pandemic. So if I could start with you and ask you to briefly outline what your interest is, and then we'll follow with Mr. Earle and then Ms. Malpass. Thank you.
Sure. So community anchor organisations are organisations that are owned and operated by the local community. They're very much rooted in place, so they're not likely to move or relocate, and quite often will use their assets to generate an income. So, for example, housing associations have stock or other community buildings that can generate an income that are then reinvested back into the community. Quite often they support kind of local informal groups or smaller voluntary organisations, and I think that was a key part of housing associations' role during the pandemic. So I think that's a kind of quick definition of the community anchor organisation.
And were either of the two housing associations that you were involved with community anchor organisations during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I would say that the Fergus Park Housing Association very much identified itself as a community anchor organisation. I think Govan is a community anchor organisation, might not recognise that so far. Hopefully that's changing.
And I wonder if I understand you did a dissertation in relation to community anchor organisations during the pandemic, is that correct?
I did, yes. So I looked at how community anchor organisations were funded during the pandemic to deliver the COVID response. So I've got maybe some conclusions, some findings I could speak about later on. Thanks.
Great. Well, we'll come on to discuss funding, so perhaps you can add something there. Then Ms. Malpass, if we could turn to you then, and again, just if you want to add to anything about what community anchor organisations do, whether your housing association was one, and in general terms, why they were important during the pandemic, including your own one.
Yes, I think that was a very good definition of a community anchor organisation. Castleton certainly is one in our local area. It is an area of multiple deprivation. I think for me, most community-based housing associations would see themselves as community anchors. They're often one of the sort of key businesses in the local area, but they're also very embedded in terms of what's going on. They have a good knowledge of the local people, the local community. They can be very quick to respond to local issues and emerging issues, and we tend to be sort of the cohesion around which other organisations form, and we can reach out and assist those other organisations too.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Earle?
Yeah, I can only echo that. I think we were a community anchor before the pandemic, but more recognised throughout the pandemic through achieving sizable amounts of grant funding. Community anchor is in my opinion, a more a community glue. I mean, I think that's how it's best described. We particularly at Dammuir Park, pulled together the community. We were very quick to self-organise, and when we attracted the funding, is organising, ordering the products that we wanted to roll out to our tenants and local residents as fast as we could through difficult times. We did do that, and we done that very successfully, but more important was that we had welfare calls, which looked after the tenants prior to the delivery of these items.
Thank you very much. Well, in relation to that, we can perhaps move on to the next general topic, which is issues and impacts experienced by tenants and the wider communities, delivery of welfare assistance and role creep. And if this can include this discussion, just for example, the key issues and impacts experienced by tenants and members of the wider communities, communication that your organisations had with tenants and or other organisations in the communities, issues around the social housing sector perhaps stepping in when and what other statutory services were doing at the time, additional roles or tasks undertaken by housing associations during the pandemic, including in relation to providing welfare assistance and support to tenants and wider communities, and the types of support provided, and perhaps as part of the discussion, just illustrating if there were disproportionate impacts on any particular groups that fall within either your tenants or the wider communities you serve. Perhaps we could start with Ms. Malpas, and also just to add that if you could also draw a distinction between the services you provided before and how that changed at the time. So perhaps we can start with Ms. Malpas, followed by Mr. Earle, and then Mr. Mallon.
Okay. Castleton is well known and was well known before the pandemic for all the additional wider role community development work that we did. So we already provided a level of assistance to local tenants and wider residents. So I will try and be clear kind of what the step up was. So I suppose the first thing was to do with, as with everybody I'm sure, sort of the welfare assistance and welfare calls we made. We already had a welfare rights service, but my housing team basically stopped chasing for rent arrears as soon as the pandemic hit, and pivoted to actually start phoning tenants and checking to see that they're okay. That was at the forefront of everybody's minds. I think just checking in with our tenants and residents to see if they needed anything. Particularly, Castlemilk has no supermarket. It has one couple of corner shops. To get to a supermarket, it's a bus journey or a car ride. We have low levels of car ownership in the area. So we're already known as being a food desert. So for a lot of the welfare calls that we were making, it was the fact that people felt they couldn't get out and get food and shopping in. So I think the key focus for us in early days in the pandemic was that provision of food for local people who were often reliant on, say, family members to take them to the supermarket, or people who perhaps couldn't stand in the queue outside of Morrison's for an hour to get into a supermarket. Again, that seems like a very simple thing for me, but for somebody who has disabilities, actually waiting that queue was just a no-no. So we were lucky to get funding through a variety of different funders, or again pivot some of our existing funding. We had some very understanding funders who allowed us to kind of shift our focus to provide food packs, deliver food packs. We worked with lots of other local organisations. So as Community Anchor, we already had sort of close relationships with other organisations in the area who, when we all worked together, I had staff going out trying to source a variety of food. Our building is a community building that the Housing Association operates out of, and that basically became filled with whatever we could find. So bags of pasta one day, or stock cubes was a favourite that we had to try and find. Juice, etc. So food was the first thing, and getting that out and utilising different organisations in terms of their delivery. We had people drivers, we had a community bus, an organisation's bus to take things around. So, and that was going out not just through our own tenants. We formed a group called Castlemilk Together. So we had lots of referrals from the whole of Castlemilk in terms of where that needed to be targeted. So it was beyond our own tenants. So I think food was the first aspect. The next thing we started to deliver was digital devices. Again, we'd already had a little bit of that before the pandemic, but we were able to get funding in for digital devices, which was really critical for people to get online, to communicate with each other, to communicate with us, for their children. We had a lot of people with school-age children who were maybe trying to share a mobile phone for their schooling, which obviously wasn't acceptable. So again, able to get those in, delivered, but importantly then our staff were able to go out and show people how to use them through doorways and windows, and having training sessions on how to turn on an iPad through a window. So all these things are kind of over and above what we did previously. Right down to delivering meals and going to pick up people's prescriptions, offering sort of befriending services, I guess, for people who are lonely, those isolated tenants. And I suppose we felt like we were often the only people who were from statutory services. We were the only people who were present in the area, able to have that sort of touch point with a face through a window, or
Sorry.
That's okay. Or constantly being at the end of the phone. And we knew that for a lot of people who were feeling very isolated, that we were the people that they would turn to.
And just in terms of engagement, how does it normally work? How do your tenants normally contact you, and how are they contacting you or being contacted during the pandemic?
So we are, because we're community-based, our doors are open, our tenants are in and out of the office all the time. We also go and walk around the estate, and people will come and talk to us, come out their doors. We go to people's homes, and also through the telephone and email. During the pandemic, it was mostly through the telephone, but again, we did have or referrals from other agencies, but again, we were still going out to people's houses, but with that, in order to deliver items.
Thank you. And just in terms of your role as community anchor organisations, you were delivering support yourselves, but were you also distributing funds for support over and above that?
Yes. So we worked collectively with a variety of different organisations within Castlemilk. So we got money in for, say, food provision, but that was going out across the whole of Castlemilk, working in partnership with other organisations. Same with digital. I think the key for us is the need in the community didn't stop at the end of the street of our tenants. It was much wider than that, and there was no point unless we were kind of trying to affect change for everywhere.
Thank you. And you mentioned specifically digital devices being distributed. I missed, did you say, was that to your tenants or was that to the wider community as well?
Both. So it was a referral system to see who needed them.
Thank you very much. Mr. Earl, if we could turn to you next, and if you wouldn't mind speaking up, apparently it's just struggling a little bit to pick up your voice, so
okay.
Maybe you could just raise the volume a little bit. Thank you.
Sure. Almost echoing what we said there, the tenants had lack of general assistance to start with. Again, no transport to supermarkets, and it was more expensive to shop local. There was reduced income coming into the area due to job losses, furlough, to name but two, and just as Claire said, there are minimum forms of modern communication at that time. There was very little smartphones, or maybe there was only one per household, and there was also little or no garden space to exercise, which was quite important, having also with the majority of housing stock being 95% or 90% tenemental. So from the off, from day one, we had six, I think it was 6 laptops and 6 mobile phones, and we made the welfare calls and then started to email out to our tenants. Every tenant received one of these phone calls. We've also got the 2 sheltered housing complexes. We made sure that they had essential day-to-day household essentials, and also the wardens there had socially distant door-to-door calls to ensure that these residents were safe in their own environment. We, like Claire, rolled out food vouchers, hot meals. We assisted in prescription deliveries, activity packs, and, as I said, IT products. We were fortunate to get funding for that too, where we could then distribute a number of iPads and smartphones throughout our housing stock.
And I think in terms of products or assistance for children and families, was there anything specific that you rolled out in relation to that, such as we've heard talk about activity packs and that sort of thing? Was that something your organisation delivered?
Yeah, 100%. That was one of the first rollouts to were residents, including splitting that out through adults and the children in the area. And to do that was difficult because some of the companies that we were using were furloughed, that had furloughed the staff themselves. So it took just that little bit longer to get that. It was regimental, to get that rolled out. But once we had it on site, then we mobilised the staff that were available to get that right through the housing stock.
And what sort of packs were you distributing, and how were they received?
So they were well received by the tenants and the residents. We had jigsaws, we had games, we had small cooking skill games, recipe books. Food vouchers was contained within these packs as well, but it was during delivery was very humbling, and to actually have to drop these off at people's doors, and it might only been the excuse me, it might only have been that person that they saw that day or even that week, you know, so you could actually do the check-in, the welfare check-in at that time too.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mallon, if we could then turn to you, please. So we're still on the issues and impacts experienced by tenants in the wider community and the delivery of welfare assistance and any role creep. And if you could perhaps, if there is a difference, distinguish what was being done by Govan Housing Association and Fergusley Park, if there is a distinction.
Being honest, I can't really speak about what was delivered in Govan, so I'll just focus on what was delivered in Fergusley Park. I think for me, in terms of who was impacted most, I think a lot of assumptions were made when the rules around social distancing, etc. were made. So if you weren't a traditional family, if you didn't have a car, you would have found it even more difficult, as difficult as it was without all that. So that impacted on a lot of our tenants in a lot of different ways. I think overnight a lot of our tenants were lost their income, so they're either furloughed or they were made redundant. And like Claire had mentioned, our welfare rights team had to address that, so we increased the capacity there. There was, for a lot of our tenants and a lot of the wider community, there was an increased cost of having children at home. So just, for example, just feeding them, heating the house, homeschooling. So when we spoke to the local school, one of their concerns were a lot of families didn't have basic stationery or basic supplies that they could homeschool. So one of the first things we did was provide the local school with those kind of resources for those collective families who needed them most. There were also really practical things, like a lot of the families we worked with didn't have a dining table. And if you've got 3 or 4 children, you're trying to homeschool them, like Claire mentioned, maybe from a mobile phone. You know, really practical things we did there to support those families. That included purchasing digital devices, so I think we all got access to the same kind of funding around that. Again, as Other mentioned, the physical aspects of it. So we had a number of, although Ferguson Park is quite close to a retail park, if you don't have a car, it's really difficult to get there. So we had lots of families relying on the local corner shop, and they were kind of saying the cost of buying nappies or other kind of basics almost doubled overnight. And again, the kind of access to space. So we had a community centre, and a big focus for us was bringing the community in. But actually, we had to keep them away from that, and that was a lifeline for a lot of people. And I think one of the big impacts was that kind of social isolation, and I think that went across the whole community. So you had older people who weren't maybe seeing folk for days on end unless we were knocking on their door. You also had, I think, a big impact on people's mental health, both adults and children. And I think that's when things like the activity packs come in. So, you know, justifying to funders buying folk £20 worth of stationery, games, etc. It was about saying this gave families and individuals a bit of structure to their day, a bit of kind of creative release. And what was really important for us is how we use that to connect people to the community. So there would be activities there, and people would upload their kind of pictures or their resources, or they would put a display in their gardens that would then kind of be a feature on things like social media, things like that. I think a big pivot for us was around that community anchor role. I think that really stepped up for us. And I think the big change for us was around us as a housing association being more outward focused. So speaking to funders, speaking to other partners, bringing in resources, but then trusting those smaller, more informal groups. And it got to the point nearly every street had some form of group whether that was a kind of formal committee or whether that was a kind of WhatsApp group with a lead volunteer. And we were able to bring in the resources, we were able to manage that budget, we were able to do the monitoring, the evaluation, do all that kind of bureaucratic stuff, whilst actual local volunteers and local individuals kind of delivered on the ground. So I would say that was a massive pivot for us there.
Thank you very much. Unless anyone's got further to add in relation to impacts, I mean, we can bring them up in other topics. We can perhaps move on to housing-related issues and impacts, and given that you all represent housing associations, we would be remiss of us not to have this as a standalone topic. So if we could cover things such as, for example, protection from eviction, rent arrears, and ability to carry out repairs to property and resulting impacts from that, including, for example, deterioration to properties and any other relevant key issues. And if we could perhaps start with Mr. Earl. Mr. Earl, I've been asked to ask you to speak up again, if that's all right. I think that it's maybe just the angle to the mic, but if you wouldn't mind speaking up, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, start with Mr. Earl, then Ms. Mallon, and then Mr. Malpass. Ms. Malpass.
Thank you. Well, at Dammuir House, we took pride in achieving 100% success in the landlord gas safety records, where we managed to get into all our or access all our tenants' houses to do that legal responsibility, which was great for the association. However, there were instances where the general checks of the apartments, the houses, the flats, whatever it may be, we couldn't gain access to that just because of the restrictions that were in place. And then when we managed to get into these, one or two of these houses were in some dire state. One, for example, somebody had been using that as a meeting place and had left it thousands of pounds worth of damage. So that would have been picked up had we been able to obtain access and do our checks. Also required a lot of general waste removal at that time too. But just like other housing associations, reactive repairs were stopped. Cycle maintenance and major repairs, with only really the emergency repairs being undertaken. The rent, but like what Claire said, I think more focus was on the welfare of our tenants at that time, which was absolute priority. However, there was a softer approach on the rent arrears collection. It still had to be done, but we knew that there was basically more important things to look at than simply collecting the arrears.
Thank you. And is there anything else you'd like to add in relation to housing at this point? We can always come back once we've gone around the room. If we could then go to Mr. Mallon, and Mr. Mallon, I've been asked to ask you to speak up as well, if you don't mind, please.
Yeah, no worries. I suppose it's the area where I have least knowledge, but one of the things I am aware of is that in Ferguson Park, the change around evictions did bring in a different attitude around how the housing association supported tenants. And as a result, the focus has become a lot around tenancy sustainment, and I think that practice has continued. As a result, actually, rents have gone down, and the cost of the cost of chasing rent arrears has also gone down, because there's less cost involved in taking legal action, and as a result, there's more money to invest in tenancy sustained activities. So I think that's been a real positive and a real opportunity to learn from the pandemic around that. I know in general, housing associations have reported that the condition of a lot of their stock has decreased as a result of the pandemic, and I think a lot of associations, including Govan, are still feeling the impact of that with increased repair costs.
Thank you. And just in terms of protection from eviction, was there anything specific in relation to that, in addition to rent arrears, that either of the housing associations was doing?
Yeah, so I suppose Ferguson Park took a very different approach to supporting their tenants, so therefore the focus became around tenancy sustainment rather than making sure that all the kind of processes were followed around pursuing eviction. So a housing association would say evicting a tenant is a failure on their part, but the protections around that created more of a focus on that tenancy sustainment aspect of things.
Thank you very much. Ms. Malpass.
Yes, so with regards to the eviction ban, I think it's been said by my colleagues, eviction is always the last resort for social landlords. We will do everything in our power to sustain that tenancy. That's what we're proud of, and work with tenants. Castleton has done that for a long time to try and get them to the situation where we don't have to evict them. It is a failure. We don't want to add to the homeless situation. So I suppose for us, the eviction ban, we probably wouldn't have evicted anybody during COVID anyway. It wouldn't be part of our ethos. I think for us with the eviction ban, we had some tenants sort of anecdotally saying, we just won't pay our rent because we know you can't evict us. And they created that little bit of mentality, actually, post-COVID, which has had an impact on our rent arrears. So our rent arrears before pre-COVID to post-COVID increased by about £100,000, which is a lot for us. Well, it's gone over a few years. It's COVID plus, I would say, cost of living crisis and the impact of what I call the Great Resignation. Lots of people changing jobs, which I see as an impact of COVID because of all the sort of staff changes in the sector. So all of that together has had an impact on our rent arrears of an additional £100,000, which is about 1.5% on our rents, which we are only now just about to kind of start mitigating against. We started pulling that back. A lot of people got out of the habit of paying during COVID, and because our staff were very focused on the welfare calls, we weren't on top of them as much as we are normally, and again it's that habit forming of people paying their rent on time. About 65% of our tenants are actually on full housing benefits, so I suppose for us it was the other people then who maybe got out of the way of paying. So our arrears did increase, and it's taken us a while to kind of get back on top of them. In terms of our repairs, very challenging during COVID. As colleagues have said, it was only emergency repairs that were considered vital. We actually spoke with our contractor and got some of our repairs reclassified as emergency. In the early days, TV aerials were not seen as an emergency. But we got those reclassified during COVID because having the TV actually was one way people who could be entertained in their homes. It was a way a lot of people were actually finding out about what was going on, watching First Minister. So for us that was essential. So it was good that there was a bit of flexibility in the end with our contractor to kind of reclassify what was deemed as an emergency. Like yourself, we were able to get into homes to do our gas safety checks, but all of our investment work stopped during COVID. So again, we had kitchens, bathrooms, windows all poised to go in, and obviously they didn't go. And the rest of the repairs, so non-emergencies, were non-existent, and that has had a knock-on effect for a couple of years really in terms of a backlog of repairs post-COVID. The backlog in repairs has been coupled with the fact that, again, immediately post-COVID, there was a lack of trades, supplies were very expensive to get hold of. So again, it had that sort of roll-on effect in terms of a much longer delay than I thought in terms of getting on top of all the backlog of work. But also then the properties that we had coming back were in a much poorer state than we'd have expected historically. So, for example, where a small leak, which wasn't an emergency, so it wasn't fixed during COVID, had been let to run on for a number of months, that created lots of rot in timbers. So something that would have cost us very little to repair under normal times was a massive repair when we went into that property eventually and had to replace a lot of woodwork, and that was kind of replicated throughout quite a few properties that we got back. Also in terms of just a general sort of wear and repair of the house. So again, we had a lot more bans after COVID, which we put down to, again, people sort of abandonments, so people who just hand the keys back and don't tell us they're leaving. And we put that down to the fact that people were, again, some of those hadn't been paying their rent, they were saving up a deposit to go somewhere else. And the state of those properties, again, were not up to kind of standards that we'd had pre-COVID. So lots of just sort of hoarding in there, or just the overall sort of look of the property was in poor quality. Again, we know that people were struggling financially, so again that's when we started really seeing post-COVID sort of damp and mould coming in place, because again it's just people are COVID onwards have been struggling to heat their homes and maintain it in that way. So it's been a long process, I think, to get back to normal, and to me it feels it's only really been this year where it feels like we're back in the swing of everything, and almost caught up with everything that kind of hit us during COVID.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, or back as the case may be, Ms. Malpas, you mentioned that you weren't pursuing evictions in relation to your tenants during the pandemic. What assistance, and it's a really question for all of you.
There was an eviction ban, so we couldn't anyway.
There was an eviction ban, but what assistance were your housing associations providing or able to provide to those who were homeless pre-pandemic, if at all?
So we get what are called Section 5 referrals from the local authority. So every year we allocate 30% of our empty properties, our void properties, to homeless cases. We also have some temporary furnished flats in our stock that we house homeless cases in. During the pandemic, we had problems actually with our voids, our empty properties. Again, they weren't seen as an emergency, so we couldn't get those turned around. We couldn't get all the checks done in order to relet them to our waiting list applicants, because people still needed homes during the pandemic. We also really struggled to get meters reset. They all need to be reset. Again, working with the utility companies is always challenging, but during the pandemic it was 100 times more challenging to kind of get those things done. However, during the pandemic we spoke to Glasgow City Council, and we were able to then offer every single void property that we had coming in during the pandemic to Glasgow City Council and allocate Section 5 homeless referrals into that property. And because they were homeless, they were deemed as an emergency, an urgent case, and as part of that programme we were able to get those properties sort of turned around and to a lettable standard. So and at the end of the pandemic we were able to flip those flats, so they became mainstream tenants at the end of the pandemic, so they were able to sustain and stay within that community.
Thank you very much. And I'll perhaps just ask Mr. Mallon and Mr. Earl, just in relation to your own housing associations, to what extent you were able to provide accommodation for pre-existing homeless tenants during the pandemic, and maybe start with Mr. Mallon and then go on to Mr. Earl.
I don't have any hard facts or information. What I do know is that Ferguson Park has quite a low turnover of stock, so we don't have a lot of vacant properties on a kind of annual basis. In terms of accessing properties in order to relet, it was about adopting new practices. So again, there was that kind of focus that Clem said about, support people in who were homeless, because that was an emergency. Also meant using technology to ensure folk could view flats and could see if they were suitable, that kind of thing. So there's a kind of big element of upgrading staff skills around all of that. That's all I can really contribute there, sorry.
Thank you. And Mr. Earl?
Yeah, I don't think I can add much more to what Jamie had said there.
Thank you. Just before we move on then to the next topic, which is turning to discuss issues around key workers and key worker status, if I could just ask you briefly a question relating to the previous topic and about impacts on your tenants and on the wider communities. Were there any particular groups of tenants or just members of the wider community that were disproportionately impacted that you'd like to flag under that subject? And perhaps we can start with Ms. Malpas, followed by Mr. Earl, followed by Mr. Mallon.
Yes, I think we've kind of touched on that in terms of our conversations already. So for me, it was families with school-aged children. Again, because we're in an area of deprivation, it was the digital devices. Single people with mental health issues who are feeling very isolated, older people, again, because of the social isolation and not being able to go out and do things. For me, and I think Jamie touched on it already, the majority of our tenants live in flats with a drying green out the back, so no real green space. We are very fortunate that as an association we've been working with the council for a number of years to regenerate the local park, and a lot of our tenants and wider community were able to go and use that for their sort of social walking. So yes, I think older people with health issues, people with school-aged children, and as an area, because we're socially deprived, I think, if you look at it in a wider context, the residents of Castlemilk and all the deprived areas were impacted more than people in more affluent areas.
Thank you. Mr. Earl, anything to add in relation to disproportionately impacted tenants or members of the community?
Yeah, well, obviously I could echo what Claire was saying there, but maybe one of the aspects where Dammuir Park, that there was two sheltered housing complexes where, as you can understand, it's a lot of elderly tenants that reside in these properties, and they were looked after, but we also had the unfortunate case where one or two or more had passed away through that the pandemic, which had a ripple effect on the tenants, the other residents within there. So I would say that the sheltered housing complexes were the real focus for the association. Obviously mainstream housing as well, but the sheltered was the main area of concern.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Mallon, anything from you on that?
Yeah, just echoing the comments made before, I think the biggest group of people impacted were those living in poverty, and that was a majority, if not all, of our tenants. As an aside from that, I would agree, people who were living alone, a lot of older people were impacted, and again families as well. And I remember speaking to a parent saying, I'm in a house full of people, but I've never felt so alone, because they couldn't get out of their house. One of the big things in Ferguson Park I can remember is there were a lot of drug deaths, so a lot of people overdosing during the pandemic. And I think that's been as a result of being unseen, so not able to access services physically, not having contact with key workers or support workers, and not being seen. And there was a kind of key voluntary group that had to deal with that within Ferguson Park. So I would say that those are the kind of key groups.
Thank you very much. If we could now come on to discuss issues, and this is both for your staff and tenants, or any issues relating to key workers' status and the definition of essential key workers, bearing in mind the roles or the wider roles that you were fulfilling at the time. And if you could perhaps give some examples to His Lordship, such as relating to the clarity of definition of key workers, if there were any issues around that, whether or not staff were categorised as key workers and the consequences of that, and any other relevant key issues. And perhaps if we can start again with Ms Malpass, followed by Mr Earl, and followed by Mr Mallon.
Thank you. Yes, housing association staff were not key workers during the pandemic, which we were surprised at, as the guidance sort of rolled out, and we were certainly feeding back through. I was part of a housing sort of forum with the social housing regulator, feeding back that we felt we should be seen as key workers. We felt that that the work that we were doing in terms of keeping people safe in their homes, in terms of allocating homes to homeless people, in terms of some of the repairs that were going on, and as well as the food provision that we're doing, we should have been deemed as key workers. I suppose that had a number of effects on staff and as an organisation. So as the chief exec, I had some staff saying, well, I'm not a key worker, so I shouldn't be going out. You know, there was that having to explain to a member of staff as why we needed them to do something, or they felt they weren't being given permission by the Scottish Government to do it, even though they wanted to do it themselves. So I suppose it was a bit of a grey area in terms of what we were asking them to do, matched with the permission. It meant that staff couldn't access school and childcare provision because they weren't a key worker, which again limited what they could do for the organisation and put again extra sort of burdens on certain staff if they were having to look after children and still wanted to assist with the delivery of services. I mean, we were very flexible with our staff during this whole period, but actually having them as key workers would have helped them and us. Travel again, because they weren't a key worker, we had lots of questions about whether they had permission to travel during the pandemic. You know, when we were you were only allowed out to do shopping or for your 1 hour of exercise, or crossing boundaries as the pandemic rolled on. You know, I suppose a lot of the information I've given now is kind of at the outset of the pandemic, but there were so many sort of rule changes as we went through. It's, you know, trying to remember what was permitted and not. So yes, so I think that was a big problem, a big challenge for my staff about what they were permitted to do in terms of travel. We ended up giving staff a letter signed by myself and my chairperson, explaining why they were out and about and what they were doing, and so if they were ever challenged, then they had this letter that said, you know, they are out going to the cash and carry to pick up food provision, or they are travelling into the office from a different local authority to fulfil a certain purpose. And none of my staff were ever stopped, but it would have been much easier for me as a manager if they were, as an organisation, as if they were classified as key workers, and I think they should be in the future.
Thank you very much. Mr. Earle.
Yeah, I mean, we've said it a few times about echoing previous words, but almost word for word there. We had a small selection of staff who, in our opinion, were key workers, self-entitled by themselves and the association, and not named by the Scottish Government as is. We delivered crucial and key services to the tenants and residents through the absolute toughest period of the pandemic, which was March 20, certainly right through to the end of that year. We were basically the frontline responders, and I think when the residents of the area knew that we were there, they felt a lot more comfortable and a lot more reassured that there was somebody else at the end of a phone or an email that they could respond. Like Claire said, we were given letters signed by the Chief Exec to say that we could, or we were representing the association for a specific task. And again, echoing there, myself personally was cross-bordering on a daily, well, maybe not a daily basis, but on a regular basis to get to work. And there was obviously other employees who, again, had different home lives. You know, they had kids or elderly parents, grandparents, and maybe families with underlying health conditions that had that reluctance to step outside the door, based on the fact that they weren't actually named key workers.
Thank you very much. And then Mr. Mallon.
Again, can't really add more to that, just echoing the points already made by other people. I think one of the big frustrating, and again, the rules changed and were tweaked quite often. I think one of the main frustrations from our organisation was around passing through different local authority areas, and that seemed quite bureaucratic at the time, and prevented quite a lot of good work being delivered because of certain rules.
Thank you. If we could then turn on just to discuss, and we've touched on it already, but just to discuss financial support and in particular issues around it during the pandemic, including, for example, the funding model that applied during the pandemic for your organisations, both in relation to the activities you carried out, but also in relation to your role as community anchor organisations, flexibility, stringency of criteria and monitoring, matters relating to trust, and that's between funders and organisations, speed of delivery of financial support, and any ongoing impacts, including the current financial support situation. And perhaps we can start, given that this relates somewhat to anchor organisations, with Mr. Mallon, followed by Ms. Malpass, and followed by Mr. Earle.
Yeah, I think what was really important was the flexibility given to organisations receiving funding from different bodies, and that was a key difference. You kind of touched on the kind of trusting element of it, and I think that was a major step change in how community anchor organisations were funded as a result of the pandemic. Local organisations, groups, community anchors were provided with sums of funding and trusted to deliver a service that met the needs of the local people, and I think that worked really, really well. It also meant that we could deliver at speed, so quite quickly we could mobilise, because that funding was given to us in a trusted fashion, whereas the kind of model before would have been for us as an organisation to apply for funding, wait for that to be assessed, wait for feedback, then wait for an outcome, and then be granted the funds, potentially in arrears, after you've delivered the project. Whereas during the pandemic, most funders were kind of upfront and quite quick and responsive in how they provided funding to third sector community anchor organisations. And having spoken to a lot of funders, they've reflected on that and kind of said, well, a lot of what we did before was quite bureaucratic and wasn't really needed. We kind of asked for information we would like rather than information they would need. And I think there's been a real step change in the kind of funding environment around that. My kind of big fear is a lot of funding organisations, particularly those within the statutory sector, have kind of reverted to old ways. And I think it's been a massive failing moving on from the pandemic. I think what really transformed and pushed our delivery was that kind of relationship with smaller organisations. So again, us as a community anchor organisation, managing funds, managing the administration, make sure it's monitored and evaluated appropriately, but trusting those kind of smaller, informal, third sector community groups to deliver has been a big learning point for me.
Thank you very much. Ms. Malpass.
Yes, so before I was Chief Executive, I was the Regeneration Manager for Castleton, so I was responsible for applying for funding and managing grants. So I was, to echo my colleague there, delighted during COVID when one, existing funders who had been bureaucratic were actually very flexible in terms of looking at the pot of money they had for us to deliver things that we couldn't deliver, and they, and enabling us to just change the model to what was needed, which was fantastic, something that you wouldn't normally get that sort of swifter response from. And then funding that came about during COVID, as was said there, very, very simple forms. Often you're, filling in pages and pages of forms prior to COVID. During COVID, it was, what do you want to do in one page? And, in terms of monitoring, again, I've used to having monitoring regimes where, it's quarterly monitoring returns, lots of stats, often with all the evidence of spend. During COVID, there was kind of none of that. They gave you the money, they trusted you to deliver, and maybe you gave them a case study. But they knew what you were doing and why you were doing it. And I think, yes, it meant that it was simple, less bureaucratic. You got the resources to the people that needed it. Your staff were actually focusing on delivery rather than all the admin work. And it just seemed much more effective. And it's based on, we felt trusted. Post-COVID, I think, yes, there are some funders who've learned that lesson, but I've just recently done an application, and it is it's gone back to being very bureaucratic again. So yes, it'd be good if funders could learn the lesson of what was a very effective delivery model during COVID.
Thank you. And Mr. Earle.
Yes, I would echo that too. The reactive. We had over £100,000 come into the association over a 12-month period, and while we had a vision of what we would deliver that for, that quickly changed. So we had to react to that, and the flexibility of the funders was great. And I think that, as Claire said, rather than be more bureaucratic, the quicker we can get the funding in and out into the tenants' residents' homes, the better. Either pre, during or post pandemic. The one part of the financial support where we slightly suffer, or we did suffer as an association, was, I think we touched on earlier on, that we had a care sector where we had an out of school care group. Now a lot of other sectors were softly or adequately funded to the extent of, at the time, they had small business support. Our out of school care group received no support, no financial support from there, either during that or post COVID in the sort of rebuild. And that, had it not been for the association being there and using the reserves and previous surpluses, then that would have closed, and ultimately that would have a massive knock-on effect to an area already in deprivation and low income. So maybe the income streams in a different manner would have been better to be looked at there. Yeah.
And you mentioned using the reserves. Was that topped up at all? Did you receive any funding to compensate for that use of the housing association's
it was more reserves being, we're on a break even on the out of school care group, but in previous years it would have surpluses, would be kind of ring fenced to supplement any swish in other years, but over the last couple of years these surpluses have been used up. Whereas I know maybe in the hospitality sector there was grants given there for recovery, and in the care sector there was none provided for that.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have anything to add in relation to financial support, including support provided to your organisations? Mr. Mallon.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, I think one of the really effective things has been around that different funding model. So we were able, for example, to give a group of older people funds to set up a kind of a Meals and Wheels type service during the pandemic, and they kind of said, well, we want to sustain this after the pandemic and bring people together and set up a lunch club, and they've done that, and that's now sustaining, and it's not costing our organisation any money, it's not costing the public sector any money, it's generating its own income. If we had said to these group of older people, actually you need to become constituted, you need to open a bank account, you need to have meetings that are minuted, and you need to go to funders, apply for funding, you need to wait 6 months for the outcome of that and then start to deliver, they would have said, no, this is not something we're interested in doing. But because we were able to kind of front load that and give them the money to deliver that service, they then said, well, we have an interest in sustaining this, so we will go and set up a constitution, we will set up a committee, we will open a bank account, we will go and pursue some funding opportunities. So kind of putting the things in reverse and looking at things a different way, we've actually increased the provisions within the local community without adding any cost to either local groups or the kind of public purse.
Thank you very much. Unless anyone else has anything to add on that topic, we can perhaps move on to the next one, which is issues and impacts experienced by housing associations. And if you could perhaps include for His Lordship examples of operational matters that you encountered, impacts on staff, including sort of workload, impacts on mental health and well-being of staff, and any other relevant key issues. And if we can perhaps start with Mr. Earle, followed by Ms. Malpass, and then come to Mr. Mallon.
Yeah, thanks. I touched on earlier on about from day one, the lack of IT. It was basically, we went home and we had 6 laptops and 6 mobiles, and very quickly there was maybe 1 or 2 people from each team identified as being that sole contact within that team working from home. Which put an impact on individuals, as many of them were covering for other teams as well. Then there was the cost of purchasing additional IT equipment, which was paid for directly by the association. The IT itself, nobody had really heard of Microsoft Teams and Skype prior to that, and that was kind of crucial in pulling everybody together. But the negative to that would have been the reliability in individuals' homes as to the service provider of the internet. You know, as the teams kept dropping or just bad connections. The working from home as well, while the summers were very good, obviously the impact cost to the staff working from home, heating, lighting, and possibly at one stage the stress of having to work at home and also do homeschooling. And I know that was particularly difficult for a number of people. And then towards the end of COVID, the reluctance of certain staff members to return to work if they didn't have a car. You know, it was the lack of confidence of returning on public transport. So they maybe had to work from home that little bit longer until that confidence was brought back up. Maybe going into maybe hybrid working or long-term working from home. I suppose the resident negatives would be the fact that Danmuir Park, as I said before, was predominantly tenemental. And the summers of 20 and 21, you probably remember, you know, was the best summers you'll ever have. And the tenemental stock very, very low and little outdoor spaces. So actually having that recreational space, the hours walk, the keep fit, that was all very, very limited. So yeah, that was the majority of the impacts that we would have experienced.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Malpass, anything that you'd like to say in relation to impacts experienced by your housing association and staff?
Mm-hmm. So more by luck, we had enough laptops. We'd had a digital programme running, so we had some old laptops which we were able to use for our staff. Phones was an issue. A few people had mobile phones, but not everybody. But I was very fortunate that my staff team used their own phones. They were happy to do that initially in order for us to get up and running. That we were able to sort of go to home working very quickly. Again, just by luck, I think, more than by planning. Change days now, we've put a lot of investment into our digital infrastructure to make sure that would never happen again. In terms of operational matters for staff, so yes, working from home. We had a number of staff actually who we had young staff who lived with their families. So they felt that they were having to work from their bedroom, a small bedroom, which wasn't good. We had a few members of staff who actually live within our tenement stock. So again, working from home wasn't great for them when they were discussing other tenants with their family around. So it wasn't, you know, I suppose some of my staff team live in properties that aren't in an affluent area. They don't have a dining room table to work from. They don't have a study. So we took the decision to bring some of those staff back in to the office. Again, we were quite fortunate in that our office is a community building as well. It was already being utilised for the food drop-off. So the building was already open. And it's an old stone building which is very has lots of gaps and big windows that we could open. So in terms of ventilation, it was very good. So we were able to sort of separate those people out, and that alleviated things for them.
Ms. Malpass, if we could just pause quickly. I think we've lost Mr. Mallon. I'm not sure if we'll get him back, but just not to leave him out of the conversation.
Okay.
So.
He's back.
He's back.
Okay.
Yes.
So yes, because it wasn't working for them being at home, both from an operational level, but also for their health. You know, working on their bed wasn't good. Yes, that was the key thing for us, is being able to bring people back in. We did a lot of work during lockdown to engage with our staff team to keep their morale up. lots of things about well-being, lots of sort of virtual meetings. We did a virtual round the coast walk, don't ask, but again encouraging people to go out and log their miles. I suppose for me there was a big impact on me because I was the person organising all that as the chief exec, but for senior staff, keeping that staff team and that staff morale going, and keeping that sense of connectedness with each other was a big thing during the pandemic. Something I didn't mention earlier, but staff were having to deal with some very difficult issues as well. The phone calls they were having with tenants, often people were quite distressed and upset. At the end of the tether, we had a huge increase in antisocial behaviour allegations during COVID. Again, just people living on top of each other with nowhere to go. And trying to resolve those was impossible really during COVID. So our staff team took a lot of that on themselves, and again it was just making sure that they were feeling well supported. Coming back into work, I'm fortunate that I've got a staff team who actually really like being with each other, and they're all desperate to get back into the office. But we did have a couple of members of staff who were more reluctant than others. Again, it's that confidence. It was potentially a couple of members of staff who hadn't even gone into a supermarket during COVID. They'd kind of got themselves into that sort of mindset, and other members of their family were doing it for them. And again, it probably took for one particular staff member, about a year for them to feel comfortable sort of interacting with everybody else back in the office, but that's all over now. So yes, it was keeping everyone going, keeping that morale up, and keeping that sense of sort of purpose and togetherness on top of the additional responsibilities that they were having over and above their job was key for me.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Mallon.
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, again, echoing the comments my colleagues have made. The lack of IT provision. I think one of the things for us at the early stages was access to PPE. That was understandably prioritised for other kind of groups and organisations, but it really stymied the kind of work our staff could do out in the community. I would agree with other people, mental health and wellbeing for our staff was really important. Maintaining that was really important. So firstly, just around their own personal mental health and wellbeing, and like Claire, our team walked to Cambino and we did other similar things, but also dealing with members of the community who were either struggling, really vulnerable positions, potentially unable to help them because of social distancing. That became a big stress point for staff, and I would agree our younger staff were a key priority as well. Mostly about how do you support them when you're not with them physically, and how do you train and induct and support staff. But yeah, they don't own their space, they don't own their home. They're usually living with parents or living with flatmates, and how do they find the space to work. So again, like Claire, our organisation quickly moved to social distance office use. In terms of working with our tenants, we made the most of social distancing and outdoor working. And that quite often meant, luckily in Ferguson Park, there are a lot of front gardens, so it meant working with whole streets and having people in their gardens. So we did a lot of activities around reducing social isolation, so that was like street bingo, street discos, all those kind of things. But yeah, I would say mental health and wellbeing was the major issue for both staff and tenants.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on then to the final general heading that we have, which is potential lessons to be learned. So I'm going to ask you, based on your experiences the experiences of your housing associations during the pandemic, if you have any suggestions to share with His Lordship for what the Scottish Government could do to mitigate ongoing impacts of the strategic response to the pandemic, or could do differently in the event, or to improve matters in the event of another pandemic or other emergency. But as part of that, I'd invite you, we do have your roundtable report. If there are any other impacts or issues you wish to highlight, if you could do that at the same time. And if we could perhaps start with Ms. Malpass, followed by Mr. Earle, and finish with Mr. Mallon.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've heard it already, which is about the funding environment. I think that's key, is that quick response and the flexibility and light touch. That should be definitely continued now, and if there is any sort of crisis in the future. Clear and consistent guidelines, I think, again, for us, it changed a lot. There was a lot to take in. Sometimes announcements would be made by the TV, but then you'd go and you'd check the guidelines and they weren't necessarily up to date. So I absolutely appreciate everyone was under pressure to kind of get everything up to date. But I think, again, when you're running an organisation in the way that we were, having those clear guidelines is critical, because, you know, you have everybody else reading them too, and if it's not matching up with what you're saying, then there's a problem. We've heard already about key worker, so making sure that housing association staff have key worker status. I suppose what I think should continue, and what worked really well during the pandemic, was the role of the SHR, the social housing regulator. They were in a cross housing association sector group, of which I was part of as well, and I was very pleased with their response with us, with the housing associations, and the flexible approach and supportive approach that they took with the sector in terms of their role. So again, it's for the regulator having that ethos of flexibility and open channels of communication. And again, the other thing I think that's key to take forward is the levels of communication across the sector, which isn't always a Scottish Government action, but for the sector itself, I think that was really, really important, and learning from each other in terms of what was working well for each other during that time, and checking in with each other and seeing what we're all doing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Earl.
Yeah, I mean, I think the community anchor organisations, they must be more supported and respected, with the realisation that they're absolutely key to the local and wider area in which they operate. We know that tenants and residents and other people within the local and wider area do rely on reliability and support, and I think that the housing associations through that period stood up and were counted and returned to the were respected by the residents and tenants. I think we touched on the funding, and the funding was, they say, generous. There was large amounts of funding came through that period, and the flexibility was really good, so we could distribute that very, very quickly. I think ongoing, while there's still tranches of funding available, it's certainly not enough, and certain aspects regarding the food crisis and so heat and heat, if you like, it still remains, but the funding itself has been vastly reduced, and I think we really need to look at that. We really need to look at that more specifically than we are doing just now. And probably just finally, and I know we haven't invested a lot in digital technology, but even when another pandemic comes along, or we have to be more responsive, then that we have the right equipment at that time. You know, there is contingencies in place to make sure that we are ready to hit the ground running should anything occur in future. Thank
you very much. And finally, Mr. Mallon.
Yeah, again, fear of repeating what our colleagues have said. I'm a huge advocate of the community anchor model. And I think as we see more public services remove themselves from local communities because of the kind of financial challenges they face, there's an increasing reliance on community anchor organisations such as housing associations to support local people. And I think housing associations are really uniquely placed to support the distribution of funds to small grassroots organisations. We've kind of heard about the Scottish Housing Regulator. So housing associations are very heavily regulated. They've got the infrastructure and the resources to manage funds effectively, but they also are deeply rooted in local communities and have those connections that can make sure that funds that public sector organisations manage can get to those who need them the most. I think there needs to be a change in how we look at working with communities that have a range of challenges. So we've mentioned SIMD, deprived communities, poverty, but I think what the pandemic showed is these communities have a lot of assets and strengths as well. And how do we make the most of those strengths and assets moving forward in order to challenge the issues that these communities face? People living in Ferguson Park, people living in Dalmuir, people living in Castlemilk know best what challenges they're facing, and I think would be best placed to come up with the solutions as well. And I think there's been a lot of talk around how we involve volunteers, a lot of talk around how we support community groups and third sector organisation play a bigger role in society. So we've had things like the Christie Commission, we've had the Community Empowerment Act. I think the pandemic response in local communities is a real strong example of these things happening. Yet we've very quickly moved away from that and moved back to traditional practices. And I think there's something we can be doing around how do we involve local communities more in the running of public life. And I think what we've delivered over the pandemic is a real strong example of that.
Thank you very much. Unless any of you have anything else you'd wish to add, I don't have any further topics for discussion unless your Lordship has any questions or the panel have anything to add. That's it from me.
Indeed. All that remains for me to do is to thank all three of you for coming. I'm not quite sure where you are, Mr. Mullen, but wherever you are, thank you for going there and giving us your evidence. That's all. Thank you very much indeed. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
All rise.